and welcome to today's session. We'll be talking about strategic supplier contract extensions, break clauses, and additional projects to help you drive maximum value and assure your fitness for purpose. And we're going to be covering three main areas. So firstly, how to make it a win-win scenario between you and your supplier. We'll identify the fastest, safest processes for contract extensions, incentives for not exercising break clauses, and assuring additional projects achieve a fitness for purpose and help you drive maximum value for money. And secondly, showing you how to increase commercial trust between you and your supplier. Because to get best value, you need a high trust model. So we'll look at the 5 steps necessary to increase your commercial trust. And finally, we'll be looking at how to avoid specific pitfalls when negotiating extensions or additional projects. And we'll also be providing you with an opportunity to ask the experts through an open Q&A forum. So please feel free to submit questions as we go along, and we'll answer these at the end. Just to let you know, a recording of a webinar will be available and PDF slides. So if you do want these, just go into the question box and just say recording, and we'll make sure we can get these to you at the end of the webinar. Okay, and I can see some people are just logging in as we speak. So for those just joining, welcome. And for the benefit of these additional attendees, just to confirm, we'll be covering 3 main areas today. How to make any extensions win-win, and secondly, how to increase commercial trust, and thirdly, specific pitfalls you need to avoid. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the experts leading the session. So firstly, we have Martin McCluskey. So Martin, can you just say a quick hello to everybody?
Hi Steve, it's Martin McCluskey, and I have got considerable expertise in both as a client and as a supplier to public and private sector organisations. So I'll be very happy to help out with the sessions which are led by Steve and Alan.
Yeah, okay, thanks Alan. So Alan, as Martin just said, his specialisms are in commercial negotiations and mediations with strategic suppliers. Now, his background originated by being the head of outsourced service delivery for one of the largest metropolitan boroughs before moving into the private sector, where he progressed to being the head of group commercial and legal services for one of the largest strategic suppliers and outsourcing companies in the world. Now, in this session, he is going to give us some real world observations about how these strategic suppliers think and how they deal with both opportunities and risks that present themselves with these extensions. Now, since leaving that position, Martin has worked on various projects with us, and he provides the insights into why these suppliers behave in the way they do. So also we have Alan Watton. Alan, quick mic check. Can you say hello?
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that you could all attend.
Okay, brilliant. So Alan is a co-founder of Best Practice Group. His specialism is in simplifying contractual arrangements for strategic supplier relationships and optimizing their delivery performance. And he's designer of our optimized process that helps to drive maximum value in strategic supplier relationships. Finally, I'm Stephen James, the operations manager for Best Practice Group, and I tend to get involved in the larger and more complex procurements, which also the contract extensions and break clauses form a major part of this. Just to let you know, we will be covering a lot of material today, but because of time limitations, some of the information may be high level, but we will point you to some supporting information that we can either send on to you and for you to read or even chat through if you need to. Okay, so let's move on to why the information in this session will help assure a good outcome with your strategic supplier. So we've seen many times that fast tracking contract extensions or not exercising the commercial leverage provided by break clauses often ends up in material dispute between you and your strategic supplier. The reason we see this is because traditionally we've come from a very nasty end of a business and going into court and providing expert witness opinion on where these relationships have gone wrong. And this gives us a very unique perspective on specific factors that need to be in place with the objective of maintaining a strategic relationship for complex service delivery and ensuring it remains fit for purpose. Now, we've dealt with over 500 strategic relationships, and the information provided in this session on extensions and break clauses is based on a lot of war wounds, but more importantly, what really works well. And we really specialize in three things. So we get you into strategic supply relationships so you receive the benefits quickly. Secondly, we improve the performance of those relationships where you don't perceive you're maximizing the value from it. And we also get you out of these complex relationships and into something that's working much better at minimum cost and risk. Okay, so I'm going to pass you on to Alan, who will outline the key considerations that you need to have in your radar when you're doing your contract extensions or when you've got a break clause coming up. Okay, Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Steve, and hello, everyone. For those of you coming up to a contract extension, the opportunity to exercise a break clause, or if you're thinking about giving your supplier the opportunity to participate in a specific project, it's really important that you plan what you want to achieve from the supplier at least 24 months in advance of the extension or break clause becoming due, dependent upon the scope and criticality of the services being delivered. If you don't give it enough time, both you and your supplier are likely to miss some really key opportunities to drive better value between you both. So why the 24 months lead time to extend something that's already in place? So based on our experience, there are 8 key considerations that are likely to be on your radar if you want to assure your extended relationship is fit for purpose and driving maximum value, with a final and 9th consideration about how you optimize the relationship going forward. We'll go through each of these in more detail for you. So firstly, organizational outcomes. It's important to think through 3 things. I'll take you through the first one, and then I'll ask Martin to provide his view on the other 2 areas. So in the first instance, if we look at having dealt with 500 strategic supply relationships, we've been privileged enough to be invited to contribute to make these work really well. And the organizations that are leading in their field understand how collaborative they want the relationship to be. From your perspective, do you see your supplier and the services it delivers as a core part of your strategy and as a strategic partner to help your organization innovate and evolve its services? Or do you just see them as a third-party organization that provides you with services for a fee? Your perception of what strategic involvement you want your supplier to have in your organization is really critical to understand if you want to drive maximum value in the relationship. Now, I won't go into all the points of the characteristics here, but suffice to say, if you get the first 3 on the left-hand side correct and working well, our experiences of over hundreds of these relationships determines that the remaining 7 of them will follow quite well. So in that respect, if we then look at the next steps, I'll ask Martin to go through with you the next steps really of the 2 core areas that we'd like you to deal with. So over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to run through some things that you may wish to ask whether the basket of services included in the contract have a synergy for both the client and the supplier. If we use a public sector example, say a local authority, why do we typically put refuse collection, street cleansing and building cleaning services in the same contract basket? For example, building cleaning has little or no synergy with refuse collection and even street cleansing, as they are very different management styles needed and different personnel to deliver and manage these service types. There can, of course, be sharing of management overheads and sharing of premises costs, but think through why you are doing it this way. It should not be because this is what you did last time. Also, please bear in mind that suppliers often have great expertise and insights about the merits and pitfalls of what went before in your service delivery relationships. So why not ask the suppliers about what their insights are? And in a straightforward conversation, they usually will be very happy to tell you. Next, Using the same example of a local authority, bear in mind that members need to deliver services and improvements largely in democratic timescales, election and re-election. But contracts for services have to be procured, typically 2 years lead time, start to end, and then they have to be of a term which is long enough for the supplier to deliver the service improvements investment, both capital and resources, and then run the service delivery model under the new regime and get it bedded in. The last thing the elected members want is hiccups in critical personal services delivery when there is an election coming up. The latter years of a contract, it's fair to say, are often the most profitable for the supplier because they get the service delivery regime in place, and then they're actually able to run those services at a profit and streamline their resource model so that they are ready for maximizing their profit and the retendering or the extension, which is the most valuable period for them. Of course, let's bear in mind that the converse is true of suppliers if they are losing money on the partnership, where another year is another year of losses. And just one example of that would be what happened in the Carillion scenario, where they had up to 25-year contracts and were losing every year some money on the service delivery model. So they have to try and cut back cloth in order to be able to deliver a cost-effective service, which they're not losing their shirt on. So briefly, those are the future stake points that would be helpful for you to have on your radar as things that you need to go through. I'd now like to pass you back to Alan to discuss the alignment of service requirements.
Thank you, Martin. From the perspective of aligning your requirements to outcomes or the future state, as Martin just covered now, it's really important that you have the right foundations in place to make sure both your own organisation and that of the supplier are completely aligned. Our observations across the hundreds of successful relationships we've been involved with have identified that there are 8 key components for strategic supplier relationships to be successful. We won't go through all 8 of these because we're limited on time, but 2 of those components are an articulated business vision and clear service requirements. Now, the breakdown of these are on our website under the optimise process, so you can have a look at those in more detail at your leisure. But in essence, by having end-to-end future state use cases, which are mapped operational processes for how you currently work, these will help the supplier understand much more clearly, A, where you would like to improve your operational service delivery, and B, what objectives you're trying to get to and how those align with the outcomes you want to achieve for the period of the extension itself. Now, if you then look at the next step, which is really around your stakeholders, what I'd like to do is to ask Martin to talk through the real commercial diligence points that align to the stakeholders, if that's possible. Martin, would you mind taking that up?
Yes, certainly. I think it's very important for us to think through all of the stakeholders. And if you think in terms of the supplier model, then it's very dangerous ground for you to assume that all suppliers will want to come to your particular area and deliver your services. And you have got to consider things like, for example, are the service delivery areas in ascendancy or are they in decline? Do the suppliers wish to engage with that? And do they wish to have a synergy whereby they've got other contracts in a geographical area and therefore they can use the same management team in order to deliver the services to you as they are using perhaps a neighbouring local authority or a neighbouring private sector organisation. But the role of the client is at the procurement stage to actually sell your organisation as being a professionally run, competent, reasonable, rational, balanced organisation, and that you understand and respect the mutuality required, and that you'll have a balanced and fair model which you're going to engage suppliers with, because the suppliers are investing a lot of money, perhaps 1, 2, 3 million pounds to prepare a bid for a large contract, and the supplier perspective is often forgotten, as is the needs of the people for whom you are delivering the services. So, as I was saying earlier, people are often in a position whereby if services become disrupted or diminished due to a difference between the client and the supplier, then that can have very big repercussions for the elected members, which are, as we are too aware, well avoided. So I think they're just a précis of the sort of things that it's really helpful to go into, bearing in mind as a client organisation, you're selling as well as buying, and it's really helpful to actually keep that uppermost in your mind when you're engaging with the suppliers. I'll pass you back to Alan now to carry on.
Thank you, Martin. And the one of the key aspects really is to look at which Martin will cover just in a second. But one of the other key aspects is when you're looking at suppliers extending contracts, is it commercially viable actually to do so? And again, these are things that are often missed during an extension thought process. So in terms of looking at that, if I just pass you back to Martin now to look at the contract extensions and the diagnosing the honest conversations, Martin, would that be okay?
Yeah, let's talk about these in 3 risk areas. So if we've got the risk level 1, then we're in a position whereby we need to identify if the supplier still sees this market as a valuable growing market and one in which they can deliver the services profitably. Private sector organisations, in order to honour their obligations to their shareholders, do need to have an objective of making a profit, and there's nothing wrong with that. It does drive the suppliers to deliver the services. It's got to be into a viable market though. So very important to actually understand that. Are you as a client open to new ideas, and are you able to let that supplier organisation produce innovative solutions? It does depend on the nature of the organisations, and you need to allow for the concept of evolutionary improvements, even if your members and your residents that you're serving are not up for revolutionary solutions. Are the suppliers able to win enough customers to make it geographically sensible to do? Next, look at the operational results. How strong are the suppliers' operational results, and are they going to be viable to derive enough revenue to keep the business going? Can they manage effectively their cost control, and can they actually arrange for existential threats? We're all acutely aware of COVID-19 now, for example, to continue to allow them to operate as an organisation. The answer to these questions should help inform you about the risk level 3, which is about the liquidity and the operational viability of the organisations. It doesn't matter how strong an organisation is and how clever its management team are, if the market moves against them and if they are no longer able to stay within their banking covenants and deliver a viable business with operational service delivery which satisfies, if not delights, their client organisation. Bearing in mind that there are things that a client can do. Cash flow is king for suppliers. They have to stay within their banking covenants and they have to run viable businesses, which, if you have a fair and balanced relationship based upon mutuality, then you're well on the road towards delivering what you as an effective client can do to deliver professional services along with the supplier organisation. I'll pass you back to Alan now. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Martin. So the supplier's due diligence is an area that's again often omitted from a contract extension. And it's actually a really critical exercise because it helps you to have honest conversations with your suppliers about meeting any areas of your expectations that you can get better value from resetting. Most importantly, it allows your supplier to undertake a really deep dive into the outcomes that you now want to achieve for the period of the extension, by how much and by when. To have these honest conversations, though, you need to have a very high trust relationship with your supplier. Just out of interest, may I ask you just to open up your questions box and just answer yes or no to this question? How many of you perceive you genuinely have a high trust relationship with your supplier? If you could just enter yes or no, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so right, so there's quite a lot of responses coming in. On balance, it looks like there's actually less that feel as though they've got an honest relationship than not, which is a bit disappointing. Okay, but okay, so to build high trust with your supplier, there's a 5-step process to undertake. If we just bear with me 1 second. So if we look at the trust building model, then essentially you'd need to step on the first one, which would be you must choose to believe that your supplier has the best of intentions and that they are working in your interests, not just their own. All other trust building behaviors flow from this. So if you've got a strained relationship, you might feel that your supplier is taking the Michael a little bit and that you can't trust them. In these circumstances, simply choosing to trust them will feel quite foreign to you. The second step is to actually start with your own behavior. We tend to judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge others by what they actually do, by their behaviors. This means that the people around you judge you not by what you know you intended, but by what you actually do. So as a client, do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. If you trust yourself to deliver, you can start to trust other people to deliver too. And it's interesting that certainly in the relationships that we've seen, micromanaging is often a sign that you don't trust yourselves to deliver, which is why you hover over the supplier and sometimes your own team because you're just unsure about what will happen. And the consequence of this is it promotes distrust and determines that the supplier's team itself, basically, you're undermining them and discouraging them from taking the initiative. Third, declare openly your intent to trust your supplier and assume they will follow with positive intent. This clearly signals your goals and intended actions in advance and generally assumes that the individuals within your supplier have good intent and want to be worthy of strong commercial trust. The fourth step is by following your lead of starting to trust initially, when you extend commercial trust to your suppliers, they will in time, and sometimes it does take a bit of time, to also start to extend trust to others. So if you're doing what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it, eventually the supplier will start to do what it says when it's going to do it, carrying out its declared intent. And finally, the individuals within your supplier that you extend commercial trust to will, in time, as we said earlier, will start to extend trust to others. And it creates a virtual circle that leads to a much more profitable and value-driven partnership and an innovative and inspiring working environment. So by following the 5 key steps to commercial trust, this will usually provide a much better foundation for the extension going forward, or to decide not to extend the contract break. And it moves us now onto the outputs that you should expect from the supplier's due diligence exercise. So as we start to look at the due diligence actual outputs themselves, this output is the most important key step that will help you use the contract extension or break clause opportunity to realign the supplier's services and improve fitness for purpose if you don't think it's quite aligned at the present time. It's particularly important as it clarifies and articulates what your supplier understands on an end-to-end basis about the outcomes that you actually want to achieve. And on that basis, based on what they want to achieve, you can make sure that they deliver those outcomes over the extension period. If your terms of reference for the supplier to undertake its detailed due diligence on your expectations was clearly articulated in the previous step, its output from that exercise will explain what it will do, how, and why. And part of the challenge in both you and the client in articulating your requirements and the supplier thinking that it understands them is that often the supplier misunderstands those requirements, and you as the client don't necessarily realise that that misunderstanding has occurred, thus leading to problems when you don't get delivered what you expect from the supplier. So part of the reason behind this is that the supplier doesn't always want to provide you with critical friend challenge. It often worries that if it challenges your expectations, you may well take offence, or others in your organisation may well take offence, and decide not to extend the contract with them. There are other occasions where it can be an issue of supplier competence. So, for example, it just doesn't ask you the right questions in the first place, and then you don't realise that. If problems then occur in the future, the supplier can often blame you for not being clear about your expectations. But here's a really critical point, and if you take away nothing else from this session, this is really critical to understand, that when a supplier represents itself as an expert in its field, it often has implied legal responsibilities to clarify your expectations if it doesn't think they're clear, or if it could interpret them in more than one way. And because this is so important, let's just dip into this in a bit more detail. So, if we look at the supplier's expert responsibilities, in terms of the what we've just discussed about them being experts in the eyes of the law, it's worth noting and exploring just a few key highlights of these responsibilities, because they can work really well for both you and the supplier. It boils down to the extent in which your organisation originally relied on the supplier's advice during the procurement process, and how much you rely on their advice now, and the degree to which you will be reliant on your supplier's advice for any extended period of the contract. So if we assume three main types of supplier relationship, if it's a vendor-buyer, then this is the traditionally understood relationship in which the buyer really is the expert. It knows what it wants and needs, and the vendor must deliver to your individual specification and plan. The risk is, if your specification is wrong, or it's not clear enough, or you've misunderstood what the supplier is going to provide, then it can often end up as your problem. The second area is the specialist supplier. And in this relationship, you've got a much more reliance on the supplier's advice. There's mutual expertise, but the main thrust in going to market is to get the supplier's expert insights, skills, and use the technology you need to get the outcomes that you require. In this type of relationship, your organisation also brings skills, and hence there is a collaborative approach. So it's a done with you as opposed to a done to you. But in this type of relationship, the buyer is advised to say to the supplier, here is our problem, and the supplier should then come back with their skills and expertise to explain how they're going to resolve that problem and get you to the outcomes that you need. And then finally, it's the strategic role of the supplier. So in this type, the buyer is mainly reliant on the advice of the supplier. So for example, we need to reduce our costs by 30% and improve our service delivery. And whilst you as a client will obviously have your own ideas on how to do that, what you're asking the supplier to do is to look at your ideas, but most importantly, identify from their own experience the most effective manner in which they can achieve those cost savings or delivery improvements. And it's the outcome of that, so it's the delivery improvement and or the cost saving that you actually contract for, not the input of the delivery services themselves. So it's really critical to understand what the ongoing relationship is that you want for the extension period, because there's quite a lot of commercial risk mitigation potentially available to assure fit for purpose services and solutions from them. Now, the key point here, that if you do decide to be reliant on the strategic supplier for its advice, then it's important that they advise you on the fitness for purpose of the services or solutions they're going to provide you with. And there's actually been some court rulings that imply certain responsibilities onto expert suppliers, which of course most strategic suppliers are. So when a supplier represents itself as a specialist in its field, the law often implies 5 primary responsibilities upon them. So the first 3 are really to firstly validate, and that's not just tell you, but validate what they actually can deliver. Secondly, validate what they can't deliver, but importantly, validate the consequential impact of what they can't deliver. Because certain aspects, and particularly when you're in the negotiation period and the supplier says, oh, we'll reduce the implementation time, or we'll reduce strategic service time, or whatever it is, it's not always clear to you as the receiver of those services what the impact of those services will be when a supplier removes something or decides he's not going to do something in order to try and meet, say, a time frame or a price constraint. So it's their responsibility to make that absolutely crystal clear to you. And when they're making that clear, the 4th area of responsibility is they need to give advice to you with reasonable care and skill. But of course, that's an area you're probably already familiar with. But it's really important that they give you the correct type of advice. The final area that most people are not aware of is the supplier's duty to warn. Now, this is absolutely critical, because if they're looking at your requirements and you think your requirements are clear, but the supplier thinks there's more than one way to interpret this, and this is what we talked about earlier, then the supplier's got a duty to warn you that those requirements aren't clear, that there's more than one way to interpret them, and what the adverse impact will be on the project if they, if you don't change your requirements, or if they've misunderstood them in some way. So importantly there, it's the courts that actually view the supplier as the expert in the services, fit for purpose services, I should say, not the purchaser, because it's and these responsibilities apply to both strategic partners and specialist suppliers. Now, we do actually have a free paper on this in much more detail, because we haven't got the time today to go into it in the detail that we need to. But it explains these responsibilities in more detail. If you'd like a copy, if you just go into the comments box and put in VR and then press return, we'll send you a link after the session, and then you can get that there. Okay, so as we now move on, we'd now look at what's called the soft market test. And having gone through the previous 5 steps, so you've clarified your outcomes and requirements, you've agreed them internally, you've spoken with your supplier and having it done detailed due diligence on your expectations, you may want to informally explore the art of the possible with other suppliers in the market. Now, this wouldn't be a detailed exercise. It's really just to explain to other suppliers, so not your incumbent supplier, that you've got a procurement coming up potentially in a couple of years, and that you want to informally explore how those suppliers would approach achieving the outcomes that you've explored with your existing supplier. Outline to them that you've got the opportunity of either going for a new procurement or to extend the existing contract for a couple of years. Most strategic suppliers are in the market for the long term. So you'll often participate in exploratory market testing if they feel that their services will create such good value for you that it would make more economic sense for you not to extend and to go for a reprocurement than it would be about extending. But in fairness to the other suppliers, be open about your options and the process that you're adopting. So you can use these inputs from the soft market test to have a final internal checkpoint with your internal stakeholders before you actually extend the contract to determine whether it's really worth exploring your decision to extend or not. If the informal market test reveals good reasons for you to seriously consider not extending and instead going back out to market, then be open with your incumbent supplier about that and discuss your reasons why. And as a key consideration at the early stages of deciding whether to extend or reprocure the services, at step 3, which we outlined earlier, if at that early point you don't really have a feel, or you'd have a preference one way or the other, then we'd suggest you undertake the soft market test at a much earlier stage, rather than here, to inform the extend or not decision process. because this now moves us on to the commercial trust negotiation process and thoughts. So at the moment, your supplier's completed its due diligence and you've got the output from that exercise in those previous 2 steps. You've done some soft market testing as well, and that's really informed your view at the present time whether it's worth extending with your current incumbent supplier, which you've assumed it probably does at this stage, and all being that you could realign some of the services because these other market testing processes you've done have highlighted 1 or 2 areas that your existing supplier didn't think about. So it's always worth discussing those. If you've got a strong commercially trusted relationship already, then you can have open dialogue with the supplier as to how they can incorporate those added value services so you can actually achieve your outcomes faster between you. But if you've not got a relationship based on commercial trust, then either don't extend the contract at this point or go through the 5-step process that we've already talked about. So, you know, the 5 steps that we discussed earlier, again, it's really critical to make sure you've got that trust process in place if you're trying to drive really good value from the process. And then, of course, you'd need to formally extend the contract for the extension at that point. Now, where you're incorporating both contracting processes, then what you really need to do at this point, and this is the single most critical contractual step, because you're contracting here for the supplier's advice separately to the solutions they're actually going to provide. And recall the due diligence and outputs that you asked the supplier to do in steps 4 and 5. And just to emphasize from earlier in this discussion, that those 2 diligence steps do 2 primary things. They help the supplier undertake a detailed assessment to make sure it fully understands what changes you want for the extension period and how you want to achieve more value. The second thing it does is provide the opportunity for the supplier to ask much more detailed clarification questions if it thinks any aspects of your expectations or outcomes may be unclear in a material way. So these 2 points help the supplier get really deep visibility of your expectations and significantly reduce its risks of any unknowns. Now, the key benefit here, which Martin will emphasize later, is in turn, if things are unclear for your supplier, then it often puts a risk pricing premium in the cost of the services. So what this process does, it gives them much better clarity and significantly helps them reduce that risk premium, which obviously increases your added value from them. And the final benefit is in the transparent allocation of any appropriate risks to the supplier. So as an expert in its field, because the law takes the view the supplier already has the risk of asking you the right questions, if it doesn't, and or it doesn't correctly warn you of the impact of those risks, remember that duty to warn we discussed earlier, then if your requirements aren't successfully delivered from the contract extension period, then it's for the supplier to remediate that misaligned expectation at its own cost, not at yours. So in other words, the supplier can't legitimately argue it must have understood your requirements or that they were unclear, because it should have asked you the questions in the first instance, the right clarification questions. And if it didn't, as we said, it's reached its duty to warn and it has to fix the problems at its own cost. So this brings us to what a fit-for-purpose contract structure actually looks like to generate maximum value in these actual relationships. So the first point really is, and in fairness, this is the hardest thing to do when you're dealing with any outcome-based contract or you're trying to structure a contract around outcomes. It's just imagine that you wave a magic wand and the contract extension is already in place. It's running and you're getting the benefits from it. Ask yourself, what can you now achieve that you were unable to achieve prior to the extension being implemented? Which services are more cost effective and by how much? Which have been discontinued? In other words, have you quantified as far as you can what your future service state looks like for the extension and by how much and by when? Secondly, what specific objectives can you now achieve that help you get to those business outcomes you want? Again, you're imagining that this is already in place. And then third, how are you and the supplier collaborating and working together that's helping you achieve the objectives that you need? Fourth, what measurements are you and the supplier collaborating and working on? And how is that being measured with you? How are you how are you articulating the fact that you're actually collaborating and working well together, and you're getting performance management from that, and that you're working as an integrated team, therefore driving maximum value? And finally, what is your process to capture that performance so you can improve your services and learn from what's working well and learn from what's not working well over an extended period to make sure your services are constantly aligned? And then you bring those 5 elements all together to create the contract terms that drive really good behaviors between you. But if we just go back one step a minute, so if we look at what we're learning every 6 months, so we keep the services and changing and contracts aligned, then we've already discussed a process that will help you implement this and run it. So if we actually look at something that we call reshaping, and you'll find that if you talk to us, we talk a lot about reshaping, because it's what keeps the whole thing aligned over the entire term of the relationship that you have. And when you're building commercial trust with strategic suppliers, you need a reshaping process that actually makes sure you both get maximum value out of the relationship. A lot of lawyers think that provisions for change notices in contract are a one-size-fits-all, but they really aren't. Unless you've got key foundations in the contract terms and the governance that correctly supports you changing your objectives and outcomes on a regular basis, you may well find yourselves inadvertently in breach of that contract. So the prospect of a contract extension or the consideration of a break clause is a really great opportunity to align your expectations from the strategic partnership that you're involved in. It's also a point which, as a client, you'll probably have the highest point of leverage to drive better value between you. Again, we're limited on time for this, but to give you a quick overview of how we see the most strategic and collaborative supplier partnerships work that drive best value, you'd firstly review the performance of the relationship over the past 6 months, identifying the key areas and service elements that you can change and that you can test. And for those elements that work really well, you can review your service outcomes and financial models for them for affordability. And there, where those pilots have worked really well and it's affordable, you update the reshaping governance and agree the next 6 months objectives. And then it can work all the much better if you've got an independent facilitator or moderator between you and your supplier. So whether it's somebody like us that you instruct or whether you get another third party, it both keeps you honest in your focus, and it helps to take any heat out of the relationship if you're getting misagreements over things. So the cycle should be virtuous every 6 months. And that way you're keeping your outcomes, your objectives, your contract terms, your requirements and your service delivery all aligned and driving maximum value on a consistent and sustained basis. It also means that if you ever need to change your strategic suppliers at some point, your requirements, contract expectations and outcomes are always up to date. So any new procurement process means you've already got most things ready to roll, thus cutting out months of effort in a new procurement process and getting back to market. And this now leads us onto performance management. So when we look at performance management itself, this is actually really quick to explain, because in essence, you recall the reshaping process that we outlined earlier in the process. So essentially, if you just look at that process, then you'll see that this is what you follow, and it brings fresh innovation into the services because you're already capturing the performance management every month anyway in that process. So as far as you're aware, and as far as going ahead on this is concerned, then with these 9 steps, you'll see that you've outlined, you can assure your outcomes on a great value basis. It's also quite a lot to think about when you look at all of that, and we understand that. But if you follow the process and you've got your 24-month time frame to do so, then you'll quickly build a high trust relationship and drive maximum value between you. But the question now is, what if you decide not to extend? So if we decide that we're not going to go through that extension, then we'll be doing a separate session later in the year on exit and transition, but this is just to put on your radar that if you decide not to extract or you decide to take advantage of a break clause in the contract, then what you'll see is that you'll need 24 months or so again. So not just for deciding to continue, but also deciding if you're not going to continue. Because here, you've got the single largest considerations, which are the first 3 points. So you'd need an indicative exit and transition plan, the complexity of the service remit, and obviously to appoint your program manager and your business outcomes to be achieved. And as you go through these 13 points, the important thing that, as Martin stated earlier, that considering the future state of your service provision and how it will likely be delivered, whether it's a replacement supplier or a mixed economy of multiple suppliers and in-house support, these are your most critical decisions and the ones that you should invest the most time on. And these remaining points all form part of your more detailed project plan. So in essence, obviously looking at things like staff TUPE and secondment transfers you need to bear in mind, pensions obligation, because obviously you'll get involved in actuaries when you're trying to bring a service back in or outsource it to another provider. So you'll end up with your legacy providers, actuary calculations on the pension. You'll end up with possibly your own legacy providers or your own actuarial calculations. And then you might end up with the new suppliers' actual calculations as well. So this is a potential area of big dispute. So you need to have a lot of facilitation around this to make sure that works. Obviously your BAU considerations about how services are going to be transferred and by when. You've got data considerations to consider. So things like GDPR on any personal data you're holding, but most importantly as well, data migration in case the systems that you move to with a new supplier are different to your existing ones. Your right to receive services. Now this is quite important because if you get serious resistance from your supplier, because you've told them you're not going to extend, then as a very last resort, you can actually force your supplier to continue those services at a reasonable level of performance. Because sometimes when suppliers get wind that they're not actually going to continue with the contract, they can take their eye off the ball. They can remove some really good resources that you have, very skilled resources, where the services start to trip you up and actually don't work particularly well. Well, you can actually apply, as a last resort, you can apply for a mandatory injunction from the court, which, if it's successful, can force a supplier to not only continue services, but actually continue them at an increased level or a better level. But we've only ever had to do 5 of these in our entire 20-year history. So it's a very rare thing that you need to do. But if you do get a supplier that's very intransigent and obstructive, then of course it can be very helpful to you. But it is a last resort. It is a nuclear option, as we would say. And then obviously you need to consider things like your in-flight projects, and ideally not to provide any more projects if you decide not to continue anything that's going to go past the extension line. You need to facilitate and spend quite a bit of time actually facilitating details between your your existing supplier relationship, your new supplier relationships, and your existing and your own teams internally. You need to think about knowledge and intellectual property transfer of third-party contracts for things like software licenses and so forth. And you also need to think quite heavily about your exit and transition costs. Now, these really should have been covered in your original contract, but if they're not, then you need to have a process that again, a bit like the due diligence process, steps 4 and 5 we did earlier, where it helps give your supplier better visibility about what that transition and exit process will look like. And therefore, you can get a fixed cost rather than have an open checkbook against you. But there's another non-mechanical aspect here of deciding not to continue with, going with an extension, or if you decide to exercise the break clause. And I'd like Martin to sort of jump in here, if possible, Martin. And then we can actually ask you to run through some of the behavioural aspects of suppliers when you decide that you're not going to extend.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Yeah, I'd just like to go on to the next slide, if I may, Alan, please. And we'll go through 4 concepts here. And we've got a 13 of total items. I know we're a bit tight for time, so let me just try and briefly take you through these. The graph shows a roller coaster ride as these things become for me has often been the person who delivered bad news from the supplier. You first have denial, denial that there is anything wrong with their service, and they can't possibly comprehend as to why you wouldn't wish to continue with it. Resistance, exploration of where they are, and then a commitment to move forward in a better way. So looking firstly at the denial stage, where the supplier is saying, we can't believe you're not extending, we delivered a great service, it's not always been perfect, but you understood that, and so on. And that is perhaps quite challenging. What you've got to stress to the supplier at that stage, of course, is that we are going to live with this transition phase for, let's say, 6 months, possibly longer. And if we're going to have that in a stressful relationship every time we meet, then it's going to be quite a long and difficult road that we're going down. If we then look on to the next phase, when they're trying to run around and see the members and do the same arguments that they have run with you in front of different people, and tell the members what a bad person you are to work with and all those sorts of fine things, we then have to go into a stage whereby there can be threats of blackmail, there can be some unhelpful conduct, but you have to just make sure that you are always in a position whereby you have actually planned out strategically what steps you're going to go through and when you're going to go through them, and obviously also socialize those with the other people in the client stakeholder organizations to ensure that they are on board and there are not going to be any surprises for them in terms of the things that come to pass over the next few months. We then go on to the position whereby we are exploring what good would look like in terms of your transition arrangements, because you do need to move from the difficult state, which is when we're at the bottom of the curve, into one whereby we say both organizations need to deliver a service to the end users. We both need to move on to a better place. The contract is going to end. And then we do need to be in a position whereby you as a supplier are going to go and get on with your other things, and referenceability on how you behaved on exit is actually a key part for other people who are maybe going to buy services from that supplier. So that hopefully moves the relationship back onto a more even keel. We do also need to make sure that we are keeping all of the people whose livelihood is dependent upon this relationship coming to an amicable end. But you also have to watch out for the potential that the supplier may, during that difficult period, move its top flight employees off onto other projects that they consider as being green shoots for them, rather than something which is withering on the vine. So in summary, you've got to determine a commitment of one which says that seamlessly we're going to move from where we are to where we need to be. We do need to make that as unemotional as possible for all the stakeholders and for the people for whom we're delivering the service. And we need to have a unemotive response to requests for continuing to deliver service, and make sure that the parting is actually a new beginning for both organizations. And I do honestly and sincerely say that in being open and straightforward with suppliers, and as a supplier being open and straightforward with the client as to what you have to deliver for your organization, is a much better and more pragmatic way as to how we actually go through this challenging, difficult period without any tears or bloodshed, one hopes, between the two organisations, and we all move on to a better place. I hope that summarises that as quickly as I can. I'd like to pass back to Alan so that he can finalise the remaining points that we need to take you through. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Martin. So, taking the points Martin raised about the supplier's likely emotional responses if we don't extend, your internal client team ideally should have been able to preempt the supplier's response because of their existing relationship with them, obviously if it's working well. Because of this, your internal client team will probably already have on their radar what is likely to motivate the supplier to generate best value and improved commercial trust between you both. But the internal client team has to be appropriately skilled, resourced, and funded in order that it can help your organisation drive maximum value between you and your suppliers. We have another session planned later in the year to go into more detail about what good looks like for an internal client function and supplier management team. But just to give you a quick outline, there are 8 behaviours within client teams that we see evidence time and time again in the organisations that generate the most value in their strategic supplier relationships. We don't have time to go into them here, but just to say, the higher quality of the levels of competence and resourcing, the more value that you'll drive. So if you're operating at the ad hoc contract activity or even basic contract management, our experience indicates that the process of supplier management is probably costing you a lot of money and minimizing opportunities to get better value. Once you start moving into the intelligent client function, you'll more likely be generating a better return on investment. However, once you move into the expert or diversified client functions, then you'll have some amazing insights and supplier contribution to really driving your organization forward in the true spirit of partnership. Now, on that basis, if you're assessing trust with your supplier relationship, or you want to validate what sort of trust you've got in the relationship, there is actually a quick assessment you can undertake to work out the level of commercial trust that you've got between you and your supplier. And it covers 5 areas and some key questions that will provide real insights as to whether you are truly collaborating with one another. And you'll find this assessment in our paper, Improving Outsourcing Relationships. And if you want a copy of that, just enter IOR into the questions box for a free copy, and we'll send the link on to you later after this session. Okay, so that brings us really to just 2 final points to cover. So I'll hand you back to Steve.
Okay, so thank you very much to both Alan and Martin for that. And we will be getting into questions now. Just before we do that, there's an offer for anybody that's on this webinar today. There's a lot of people on. I think this is going to be quite popular, so the first come, first serve here. But if anybody wants an informal and confidential chat about whether you should be extending your contract or exercising the break clause, then let us know. And in one call, we can give you all the key principles and the actions that you need to take. So at the end of that call, you'll know about the contract, what principles are going to work for you and what's going to work against you. We'll also be discussing the outcomes and requirements. Maybe some aspects are clearer than others. You know, how do we avoid misunderstandings, etc. We'll talk about the timing, what works best for you in your scenario, and how we can build trust in your relationship. And more importantly, how to drive maximum value in either extending your current contract, doing your break clause, or doing something else. So if you want to take advantage of this, just type IC into the question box now, along with either your email address or your telephone number, and it's something we'll be able to get arranged for you as soon as possible. You know, we do have some slots this week and some more next week, so let us know what works best for you and we can do that. Okay, so on to questions. So if anyone's got any further questions, then please type it in now. I know we've sort of run out of time, so we'll probably get through 1 or 2. The first question, I'm going to probably send over to you, Martin. Somebody said they've invested recently in their own client team, and we want to know how important this is for suppliers. So should they be selling this as a fact that they've got this client team, or the suppliers are not really that bothered? Is that for you, Martin?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for that. I think it's very important, having sat on the client side and thought suppliers will want to flock to my door thinking that they may win a contract, but it's really, really important that the suppliers understand that not only are you a professional client organisation, but you're going to be fair and balanced and rational in the relationship. And on the good days, I always was. Whilst we all have our off days, I think it's really important that the supplier, given that they're investing a massive amount of money in bidding and then in operationally delivering a contract, to understand that when things have gone wrong, that they will work to correct them with you, and you will work in a rational way with them to actually get the service back on track, and you'll be fair and balanced with their organisation. And that goes down to your engagement with all of the employees as well. It's really important, the point that Alan made, which was about the trust relationship, and that the fact that the supplier and their people need to be respected and responded to in a positive and pragmatic way. So it's essential that the client sells their own competence and their own effective management team to ensure that they are fair, reasonable, rational, and have an objective of mutuality with the supplier. I think that just about covers that.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Martin. Alan, I think this next one for you. This is from David. He said the principles and the approaches you've gone through is really clear, but they have a shorter contract period of less than a year. So he's asking if all the same principles need to be used, but maybe just compressed timing, or would you have a separate set of principles when you don't have a 2-year period?
Well, in essence, you've got to if you're trying to assure fitness for purpose, but you've only got a much shorter time to do it, then there's got to be a compromise. What I would say is that in other situations we've been involved in with this is I would identify the 2 or 3 absolute most critical things, critical outcomes that you must really try and get achieved over that extended period, over that contract extension period, rather than just try and be more holistic about it. And get those agreed internally, and then sit with your supplier so they do the due diligence just on those 2 or 3 specific things to make sure you can get those outcomes for the remaining contract period. If you focus on those and then align and realign the contract just to take account of those 2 or 3 specific things, then that should be able to compress it within that shorter time window. Ideally, 24 months is better because obviously you can take a more holistic approach across all of the services. But with a much shorter time period, then just focus on the 2 or 3 things that you really desperately need, and then you can focus on that without getting distracted. Does that help?
Yep, thank you very much, Alan. Okay, so I can see we've run out of time. I know some people have been messaging saying they've had to leave and go on to other things. So I think it's probably best we'll leave it there. If anybody's got any further questions we want to send, please send it through, and we'll follow up later. And we'll be in touch over the next couple of days with re-recording and the extra things people have asked for.